Imagine being invited somewhere not to be honored, not to be respected, but to be the punchline of a cruel joke in front of the city's most powerful people. That was exactly what happened to Tamara. Tamara worked as a cleaning lady in the massive Evers Tower. She scrubbed the marble, polished the glass, and moved like a ghost through the hallways. Most of the high-flying executives didn't even see her. To them, she was just another piece of the building's equipment. So when the gold-sealed invitation arrived, it felt surreal, almost like a cruel trick. It was for the exclusive gala hosted by Jared Evers, the most powerful and arrogant CEO Tamara had ever encountered. But what Tamara didn't realize was that this invitation was laced with poison. It wasn't a gesture of kindness, it was a social ambush. But life has a way of balancing the scales. Because on the night of that gala, the woman they intended to humiliate, the one they thought would be the laughingstock, walked in looking like royalty. What happened next? No one in that room could have seen it coming. Dear viewers, this is the story of a woman who was treated like furniture in the very halls her father once built. It is a journey of a quiet janitor who was kicked while she was down, only to discover that the man mocking her present was the same man who had stolen her past. This is the account of how a single act of cruelty, a joke intended to crush a woman's spirit, became the very spark that burned down a billionaire's empire and restored a stolen legacy. Hello, family. Welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten. Voices like Tamara's, and stories that prove that dignity can never be truly erased. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. Whether you are in a small apartment or a tall office tower, we want to hear from you. Because together, we are not just telling stories. We are keeping hope and justice alive. The sound of designer shoes clicked rhythmically against the lobby floor. The surface was so polished it looked like black ice, reflecting the massive crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen rain from the ceiling. Outside, a line of luxury cars moved like a slow, shimmering serpent toward the private entrance. Inside Evers Tower, wealth wasn't just a status, it was a weapon. Everyone here looked like they owned a piece of the world, except Tamara. She wore heavy rubber gloves and pushed a gray cleaning cart, her movements slow and deliberate. Her head was bowed, but her spine remained as straight as a steel rod. At 42, her hands told a story of sacrifice and silent strength. She knew the tower better than the architects did. She knew which floorboards creaked and which offices held the darkest secrets. She had learned long ago that when people think you are nobody, they stop hiding who they really are. But there was one man who never missed an opportunity to remind her she was at the bottom: Jared Evers. Jared was the CEO. He was young, brilliant, and possessed a heart as cold as the glass walls of his office. He treated the world like his personal playground and the people in it like his toys. One afternoon, as Tamara was cleaning his private suite, he looked at her with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Be careful with that spray, Tamara. That desk cost more than your father's entire estate." Tamara felt the sting, but she didn't flinch. She needed the paycheck. Bills don't care about your pride. But today, The air in the office felt different. Jared's eyes were sharper, carrying a glint of predatory mischief. He approached Tamara, surrounded by a group of his elite board members. They were all the same, loud, expensive, and looking down at her like she was a stain on the rug. Jared held a thick, cream-colored envelope, tapping it against his palm. Tamara pulled her cart to the side, trying to be invisible as usual, but Jared blocked her path. He gave her a fake, wide smile, the kind that carries a hidden blade. "I haven't seen you around much lately, Tamara." "Keeping busy." Jared gestured with the envelope. "Well, I have a little surprise for you." He handed her the card. It was heavy, embossed with gold foil, the kind of invitation that people in Tamara's neighborhood only saw in movies. Tamara stared at it, a cold knot forming in her stomach. This wasn't charity. Jared leaned in, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "It's my annual black tie gala at the Grand Magnolia. And guess what? I've decided to invite you as my special guest." His friends stifled laughs behind their hands. Tamara froze. "A gala?" For a moment, she looked from the gold letters to Jared's mocking face, and she saw it clearly. This was a setup. A wicked plan to put a cleaning lady in a room full of millionaires just to watch her drown. Jared's smile grew wider. "Wear whatever you want, Tamara. Just try to find something that isn't a uniform. We wouldn't want the servers trying to hand you their trays." The group erupted into laughter. Tamara gripped the edge of her cart until her knuckles turned white. Her face burned, and her chest felt tight with a familiar old fire. But she didn't look down. With a voice that was steady and low, she said, "I'll be there." Jared seemed surprised for a split second, then chuckled. Tamara walked away, holding the heavy envelope like a shield. For the first time in a decade, something shifted inside her. It wasn't just anger, it was the awakening of a sleeping giant. She looked at the gold script, Grand Magnolia Estate. Saturday, 8 p.m. Black tie. To Jared, it was a joke. To the world, it was an impossibility. But to Tamara, it was finally time to show them that a queen is defined by her blood, not her broom. The rhythmic shush-shush of the industrial mop was the only soundtrack to Tamara Johnson's nights. In the vast, echoing lobby of Evers Tower, she was less of a person and more of a shadow that moved against the glass. At 42, Tamara had mastered the art of being part of the architecture. She knew the exact weight of the silence that settled over the building after the high-powered executives fled to their penthouses and jazz clubs. She knew which marble tiles were prone to streaking and which mahogany desks held the hidden remains of a stressful day, crumbled cigarette packs, spilled bourbon, and frantic, handwritten notes. Tamara pushed her gray cleaning cart with a posture that defied her profession. While the world saw a woman defeated by labor, her spine remained a straight, unbreakable line of steel. Her hands, calloused and mapped with the fine lines of years of hard work, were always tucked into thick yellow rubber gloves. Those gloves were her barrier between the world of the haves and her own quiet existence. As she moved through the executive floor, the scent of expensive cologne and stale ambition lingered in the air. To Jared Evers, the man whose name was etched in gold leaf on the double doors of the corner office. Tamara was a ghost. He would walk past her while barking orders into his phone, his tailored Italian shoes clicking sharply against the floor she had just spent an hour polishing. He never looked at her face. He looked through her, his eyes focused on the next deal, the next acquisition, the next million. Once, while she was emptying his wastebasket, he had stepped on her foot without even pausing his conversation. He didn't apologize. He didn't even notice he had struck a human being. To Jared, Tamara was simply a biological extension of the vacuum cleaner. But being a ghost had its advantages. When people assume you are nobody, they stop performing. They forget you have ears. Tamara had heard the panicked whispers of VPs worried about a coming audit. She had seen the tear-stained tissues in the trash cans of secretaries who had been berated until they broke. She knew who was cheating on their spouse and who was cooking the books. She carried 1,000 secrets in her quiet heart, but she never spoke a word. She needed this job. The tiny apartment in the city's outskirts and the mounting medical bills from her father's final years didn't care about her dignity. One Tuesday evening, the elevator chimed, and Jared stepped out, flanked by two of his youngest, hungriest protégés. They were laughing, their voices booming in the hollow hallway. Tamara pulled her cart to the side, pressing herself against the wall to give them the right of way. She kept her head down, staring at the toes of her worn sneakers. "And then I told him," Jared was saying, his voice thick with a self-satisfied drawl, "if you want to play in the big leagues, you have to dress like you belong there. You can't walk into a merger looking like you bought your suit at a mall." His friends barked with laughter. As they drew level with Tamara, Jared paused. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at the cleaning rag draped over her cart. He reached out with 2 fingers and flicked the corner of the rag as if it were a piece of filth. "Speaking of looking like you belong," Jared said, his eyes finally drifting toward Tamara with a look of profound boredom. "Make sure you double wax the conference room tonight, Tamara. We have the board coming in tomorrow, and I want the floor so bright they can see their own reflections. I don't want a single smudge. If I see a footprint, I'll consider it a personal insult to my brand." "Yes, Mr. Evers," Tamara murmured, her voice a low, steady hum. One of the protégés chuckled. "Does she even talk, Jared? Or is she programmed to just say yes?" Jared smirked, a cold, sharp expression that made his handsome face look predatory. "She's part of the building's operating system. Efficient, quiet, and cheap. Just how I like things." They walked away, their laughter echoing down the hallway like the sound of breaking glass. Tamara stood still for a long moment after the elevator doors hissed shut. The insult didn't burn the way it used to. It had become a dull ache, like an old injury that acted up in the rain. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the office. She saw a woman in a faded blue uniform, her hair tied back in a practical knot. But beneath the surface of that reflection, deep in the dark brown of her eyes, there was a spark that Jared Evers was too arrogant to see. He didn't know that the woman he called part of the operating system had once sat in rooms just like his. He didn't know that she understood every word of the business jargon he used to intimidate others. He didn't know that she was the daughter of the man who had laid the literal foundation of the city's commercial district before he was betrayed by men exactly like Jared. Tamara took a deep breath, the scent of lemon-scented bleach filling her lungs. She gripped the handle of her mop. She would finish the floor. She would make it shine so brightly it would hurt their eyes. She would continue to be the ghost in the hallway, the invisible witness to their greed. But as she moved back to her work, a new thought took root in her mind. The tower was tall, and the marble was slippery. And sometimes, the people who were the most invisible were the ones who knew exactly how to make the whole structure crumble. She spent the next 4 hours in a trance of labor. She scrubbed the baseboards where the dust gathered, the places the important people never looked. She emptied the shredders, seeing the confetti of lives and deals destroyed. Each task was a meditation. With every stroke of the mop, she reminded herself of who she was before the world decided she was nothing. She was a Johnson. She was the legacy of a man who built things to last, not just to look expensive. As the sun began to peek through the skyscraper canyons of the city, Tamara finished her shift. She changed out of her uniform in the cramped basement locker room, slipping into her own clothes, simple, clean, and worn. She walked out of the service entrance, her back still straight, her head held high. Jared Evers might own the tower, but he didn't own the ghost that haunted it. And as the city began to wake up, Tamara felt a strange, quiet certainty. The silence of the night was over. Soon, it would be time to speak. The following afternoon, the air in the executive suite felt heavy, charged with the kind of cruel electricity that usually preceded a corporate execution. Tamara was working near the glass-walled conference room, her movements rhythmic and practiced as she polished the brass handles of the heavy oak doors. She could see them through the transparency, Jared Evers and his inner circle of directors, men and women who wore influence like a second skin. They were nursing tumblers of amber liquid, their laughter muffled by the soundproof glass, looking like gods in a gold-rimmed aquarium. The doors swung open, and the sound of Jared's boisterous voice spilled out into the hallway, sharp and jarring. He wasn't leaving, he was hunting. His eyes locked onto Tamara, and a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. He beckoned her forward with a lazy wave of his hand, a gesture one might use to call a stray dog. "Tamara, come here. I was just telling the board about our most dedicated employee," Jared said, his voice dripping with a sarcasm so thick it was a wonder he didn't choke on it. Tamara lowered her head slightly, keeping her expression a neutral mask of professional compliance, and stepped toward the group. The board members, 3 men in charcoal suits and a woman draped in pearls, watched her with varying degrees of amusement and disdain. They didn't see a woman with a history. They saw a prop for their afternoon entertainment. Jared reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was an exquisite piece of stationery, heavy with the scent of expensive ink and sealed with a dollop of deep red wax stamped with his personal crest. He held it out, dangling it between 2 fingers just out of her reach. "This Saturday is the black tie gala at the Grand Magnolia," Jared announced, turning his gaze toward his colleagues to ensure they were watching the performance. The crème de la crème of the city will be there. Investors, politicians, the old guard. And I realize today that it's high time we showed some inclusivity. I've decided to invite Tamara as my personal guest of honor. A ripple of stifled giggles moved through the board members. One of the men turned away, coughing into his hand to hide a smirk. The cruelty of the gesture was so transparent it made Tamara's stomach turn. He wasn't inviting her to join their world. He was inviting the elite to join in his mockery of hers. "Go on, take it," Jared urged, his eyes dancing with a mean-spirited light. "It's a rare opportunity. I'm sure you've never even seen the gates of the Magnolia, let alone walked through the front doors." Tamara reached out, her fingers steady despite the fire roaring in her chest, and took the envelope. The paper felt like silk against her calloused skin. "Thank you, Mr. Evers," she said quietly. "Now the real question," Jared continued, stepping closer so that the scent of his expensive sandalwood cologne overwhelmed the smell of her cleaning supplies. He looked her up and down, lingering on her faded uniform and the smudge of dirt on her sneaker. "What on earth are you going to wear? I suppose you could just wash your uniform, but the invitation does say, black tie." "Do they even sell gowns at the places you shop, or do you just find something at a garage sale and hope for the best?" The woman in pearls let out a sharp, melodic laugh. "Oh, Jared, don't be Harold. Perhaps she can find something vintage. Or maybe she has a nice Sunday bonnet." Jared leaned in, his voice dropping to a mock whisper that was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tell you what, Tamara, if you can't find a dress, don't worry. I'll make sure the kitchen staff has an extra apron for you. At least that way you'll feel right at home while everyone else is dancing." The boardroom erupted in laughter, a chorus of high society mockery that echoed off the cold glass walls. Jared looked around at his peers, basking in the approval of his own wit. He felt powerful, untouchable, the master of a universe where he could elevate a servant just to watch her fall. Tamara gripped the envelope so tightly the edges began to crinkle. She could feel the heat rising in her neck, the familiar urge to look away, to disappear back into the shadows where it was safe. But then she remembered the wooden box under her bed. She remembered the name Johnson and the weight of the legacy that Jared Evers had spent his career trying to pave over. "I'll find something suitable, Mr. Evers," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its subservient edge. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time. She didn't look like a victim, she looked like a witness. Jared's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of unease crossing his face as he registered the sudden intensity in her gaze. But he quickly recovered, masking it with another bark of laughter. "I'm sure you will. I'm counting on it. In fact, I've told everyone to look out for you. You're going to be the talk of the night, Tamara. I guarantee it." He turned his back on her then, signaling that the audience was over. He ushered the board members back into the office, the heavy doors closing with a definitive thud that seemed to seal Tamara out of their world once again. Standing alone in the hallway, Tamara looked down at the gold-sealed trap in her hand. Jared thought he had set a snare for a mouse, but he had no idea he had just handed a key back to a queen. She didn't return to her cleaning cart immediately. Instead, she stood in the silence of the executive floor, the cream-colored envelope clutched to her chest. The joke was written in gold ink, but the punchline, the real punchline, was yet to come. And as she finally turned to walk away, her footsteps didn't shuffle. They rang out with a purpose that the tower hadn't heard in a very long time. The bus ride home was a blur of neon streetlights and the weary faces of people who, like Tamara, lived their lives in the margins of the city's grandeur. She sat by the window, the heavy cream-colored envelope resting on her lap like a lead weight. Every time the bus jolted over a pothole, the gold seal caught the dim overhead light, flashing mockingly at her. By the time she reached her small rent-controlled apartment in a neighborhood the city planners had forgotten, the adrenaline of the confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that felt heavier than any bucket of water she had ever carried. The apartment was silent, smelling faintly of lavender soap and the old wood of the floorboards. Tamara didn't turn on the overhead light. She didn't want to see the peeling wallpaper or the cracks in the ceiling that she had stared at for 1,000 sleepless nights. Instead, she moved through the dark, guided by the familiar layout of her modest sanctuary. She set her keys on the small kitchen table and finally let the envelope drop. It hit the wood with a soft, expensive thud, a sound that didn't belong in a room where every penny was counted twice before being spent. She collapsed onto her small velvet sofa, a hand-me-down that was the only thing she had managed to save from the wreckage of her former life. As the silence pressed in around her, the echoes of the afternoon began to play back in her mind. She heard Jared's sharp, rhythmic laughter. She felt the weight of the board members' collective gaze, a look that stripped her of her name and replaced it with a job title. The janitor. The furniture. The help. A single tear escaped, hot and stinging, trailing a path through the dust of the office tower that still clung to her skin. Then came another, until the dam finally broke. These weren't just tears for the insult she had endured today, they were the accumulated grief of a decade. They were tears for the woman who had once been the pride of her father's eye, the daughter of the great Marcus Johnson, a man who had built skyscrapers with his hands and heart only to have them stolen by the very vultures he had mentored. She wept for the years she had spent scrubbing the toilets of men who weren't fit to shine her father's shoes. She wept for the calluses on her hands and the ache in her knees, but mostly, she wept for the invisibility. To be seen only when a floor was dirty, to be heard only when a trash can was full, and to be invited to a party only to be the entertainment. It was a psychological weight that threatened to crush the very soul she had tried so hard to protect. "Is this all I am now?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice cracking. "Is this all that's left?" The disrespect felt like a physical stain, one that no amount of bleach or industrial cleaner could ever wash away. She remembered the way Jared had looked at her shoes, the way his friends had giggled as if she were a curious animal in a zoo. The cruelty of the golden trap was that it used her own poverty as a weapon against her. They expected her to show up in a polyester dress from a thrift store, or perhaps a hand-sewn disaster that would give them something to whisper about over their champagne. They wanted to witness her shame so they could feel more secure in their own shallow glory. She leaned her head back against the sofa, closing her eyes. In the darkness of the room, memories of a different life began to flicker like old film. She remembered grand ballrooms where she didn't clean the floors, but danced upon them. She remembered the feeling of silk against her skin and the way her father would squeeze her hand, telling her that a Johnson always carries their head high because they build the world that others merely live in. The grief eventually began to shift. The sobbing subsided into a jagged, uneven breath, and then into a cold, hard stillness. The tears had washed away the last of her hesitation. Jared Evers thought he was playing a game with a woman who had nothing left to lose, but he was actually playing with a woman who had everything to reclaim. She looked over at the envelope on the table. It was no longer a symbol of her humiliation, it was a summons. He wanted a show? He wanted the talk of the town? She would give him a performance that would haunt the boardrooms of Evers Tower for the rest of his natural life. Tamara stood up, her movements no longer weary but infused with a sudden, sharp purpose. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, erasing the traces of her breakdown. The darkness of the apartment no longer felt oppressive, it felt like a cocoon. The years of silence were over. The years of hiding were done. If Jared wanted to bring the cleaning lady to the Grand Magnolia, he was going to get exactly what he asked for, but he would soon learn that just because someone cleans the dirt doesn't mean they belong in it. She walked toward her bedroom, her footsteps firm on the creaking wood. Under her bed sat a wooden box, locked and hidden away like a painful secret. It was time to find the key. It was time to remember that before she was a ghost in the hallway, she was the heir to a throne. The weight of the disrespect had been heavy, but it had finally forged her into something sharper than a blade. Saturday was coming, and for the first time in 10 years, Tamara Johnson wasn't afraid of the light. The stillness of the bedroom was broken only by the sound of Tamara dragging a heavy wooden trunk from beneath the bed frame. It moved with a protest of floorboards and a cloud of disturbed dust, a physical manifestation of a decade spent in hiding. For 10 years, she had treated this box like a tomb, afraid that opening it would let out a ghost she wasn't strong enough to face. But as she knelt before it, the gold-sealed invitation from Jared Evers lay on her nightstand, its presence acting as a catalyst, demanding that the past finally speak to the present. Her fingers trembled as she brushed the layer of grime from the lid, revealing the intricate carvings of a family crest that Jared would never recognize. With a click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room, the latch gave way. As the lid creaked open, the scent of cedar and old parchment filled the air, thick and intoxicating. It was the smell of a life lived in the sun, of leather-bound ledgers and expensive perfume, of a time when the name Johnson meant power, integrity, and progress. On top of the pile lay a photograph, the edges slightly curled and yellowed by time. Tamara picked it up, her thumb tracing the glass. In the image, a younger version of herself stood beside her father, Marcus Johnson, at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Johnson Community Plaza. She looked radiant in a tailored suit, her smile wide and full of an uncomplicated hope. She remembered that day, the flash of the cameras, the way the crowd leaned in when she spoke, the way her father had leaned over and whispered that she was the true architect of their family's future. She hadn't been a ghost then. She had been the face of leadership, a woman who moved through the city with the grace of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Beneath the photos lay the heavy, embossed certificates of her degree and the awards for her philanthropic work. She pulled out a framed citation from the city council, naming her the Director of the Year for her work in urban redevelopment. Her eyes drifted over the words visionary, steadfast, and leader. They felt like words from a foreign language now, a vocabulary she had traded for yes, sir, and I'll clean it right away. The deeper she dug, the more the memories flooded back. The hostile takeover that had gutted her father's company, the betrayal of his closest associates, and the mountain of legal fees that had eventually swallowed their home and his health. She had watched her world burn down in a matter of months, and in the ashes, she had chosen the only thing she had left, anonymity. She had become a janitor because it was the one place where no one would look for the fallen princess of the Johnson Empire. She had buried her pride so deep she thought it had died. But holding these papers, the texture of the high-grade linen and the weight of the gold seals began to transfer a different kind of energy into her hands. The calluses on her fingers didn't feel like marks of shame anymore. They felt like the scars of a soldier who had survived a long, cold winter. She realized that while Jared Evers had been playing at being a king in a tower he didn't build, she had been learning the true meaning of resilience. She found her old passport, the pages filled with stamps from London, Paris, and Tokyo. She opened it to the identification page and stared at the woman in the photo. That woman wouldn't have looked down at her shoes when a petty man insulted her. That woman would have known exactly how to dismantle Jared's arrogance with a single, sharp sentence. Tamara closed her eyes, letting the transition take hold. The woman in the office tower was a mask. The woman in the wooden box was the truth. At the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, was a small velvet pouch. She opened it to find a pair of gold cufflinks that had belonged to her father and a heavy gold signet ring with their family crest. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too large, but the weight of it was grounding. It was a reminder that her blood didn't belong to the service entrance. As she sat on the floor, surrounded by the debris of her former glory, the grief she had felt earlier began to harden into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. Jared had invited a cleaning lady to his gala to provide a laugh for his friends, but he was inadvertently opening the doors for the one person who knew exactly where the skeletons were buried in his industry. He thought he was inviting a victim. He didn't realize he was inviting his replacement. Tamara carefully began to reorganize the box, but she didn't push it back under the bed. She left it open, the certificates and photos reflecting the moonlight. She stood up, her movements fluid and possessed of a newfound dignity. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above her dresser. The uniform was still there, the tired eyes were still there, but the ghost was gone. "I remember now," she whispered to the empty room. Her voice wasn't the submissive murmur she used in the halls of Evers Tower. It was the voice of the woman who had once commanded boardrooms. She turned toward the phone on her nightstand. There was one person she hadn't called in 10 years, someone who had once been her closest confidant in the world of high fashion and higher stakes. Someone who owed her father a debt that could never be repaid with money. It was time to collect. Tamara reached for the gold-sealed invitation one last time, looking at the black tie requirement. She didn't need to find a dress at a garage sale. She needed to reclaim her crown. The transformation had begun, and by the time she was through, Jared Evers would wish he had never even learned her name. The digital dial tone hummed in the quiet of the apartment, a sharp, rhythmic pulse that felt like a countdown. Tamara held the phone to her ear, her heart hammering against her ribs with a ferocity she hadn't felt in a decade. For 10 years, this number had been a ghost in her contacts, a bridge to a world she had burned behind her. She almost hung up, her thumb hovering over the red end call icon, but then her gaze fell on the gold-sealed invitation on the table. She saw Jared's mocking smirk in her mind's eye, and her grip on the phone tightened. On the 5th ring, the line clicked open. A voice, sharp and cultured, flavored with the unmistakable confidence of someone who spent their days dressing the world's elite, answered. "Hello? It is nearly midnight in Paris. This had better be a crisis or a very inspired idea." "Janet," Tamara said, her voice catching slightly before she smoothed it into a steady, resonant tone. "It's Tamara. Tamara Johnson." There was a silence on the other end, so profound it felt as though the Atlantic Ocean itself had gone still. Then, a sharp intake of breath. "Tamara? My God! Tamara? I've spent 10 years wondering if you were even still in this world. I called. I sent letters. Your father's lawyers said you wanted to be left in peace." "I was hiding, Janet," Tamara admitted, looking at her calloused palms. "I thought if I made myself small enough, the world wouldn't be able to hurt me anymore. But I was wrong. I've been living as a ghost, and someone just decided to make that ghost the target of a very public joke." Janet's voice lost its playfulness, turning as cold and precise as a diamond-tipped needle. "Tell me." Tamara told her everything. She spoke of the years spent scrubbing the floors of Evers Tower, the invisibility of the janitor's uniform, and the gift Jared Evers had handed her with a sneer. She described the laughter of the board members and the specific cruelty of the invitation to the Grand Magnolia. As she spoke, she felt the shame of the last 10 years evaporating, replaced by a cold, crystalline fury that Janet seemed to absorb through the phone line. "So," Janet said after a long pause, her voice vibrating with a dangerous energy, "this little boy, this Jared, thinks he's invited a caricature. He thinks he's bought himself a night of entertainment at the expense of a Johnson." "He wants a cleaning lady, Janet," Tamara said, her eyes fixed on the open trunk of her past. "He wants to see me walk into that ballroom in a thrift store dress so he can feel superior. He wants to show the world that class is something you buy, not something you're born with. Then we are going to give him a lesson in education," Janet declared. "Tamara, your father was the only man who believed in my sketches when I was a girl sewing in a basement. He funded my first boutique when the banks laughed at me. I don't just owe him, I owe the name Johnson. And if that name is going back into a ballroom, it's going in as a landslide." "I don't have much money, Janet," Tamara started, but Janet cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Do not insult me. You aren't a client tonight. You are a masterpiece in progress. I happen to be in the city for the winter collections. I have a private studio in the garment district that the press doesn't know about. I was supposed to be at a gala myself this Saturday, but I think I'd much rather spend my time creating a weapon." "A weapon?" Tamara asked. Fashion is armor, Tamara. And right now, you need to look like the storm that's about to break over Jared's head. I want you at my studio at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Do not wear that uniform. Do not wear a mask. Just bring the woman I saw in that community plaza 10 years ago. Bring the woman who knows that she owns every room she walks into. I'll be there, Tamara promised. Good. And Tamara? Don't look at your hands and see work. Look at them and see the strength it took to survive. We aren't just making a dress. We're reclaiming a crown. Sleep well, my friend. Tomorrow, the ghost becomes a queen. When Tamara hung up, the silence in the apartment no longer felt heavy. It felt like the quiet before a symphony. She walked over to the mirror and pulled the rubber band from her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. She looked at the gold signet ring on her finger. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, humming anticipation. Jared Evers thought he was the master of ceremonies, but he had no idea that he had just called the queen-maker to the field. Tamara closed her eyes and, for the first time in a decade, she didn't dream of the floors she had to clean. She dreamed of the floor she was going to conquer. The morning sun had not yet pierced the city's skyline when Tamara stood before the unmarked steel door in the garment district. When it buzzed open, she stepped into a world that felt like a fever dream of velvet, industrial sewing machines, and rolls of fabric that cost more than her apartment building. Janet was already there, a measuring tape draped over her shoulders like a royal stole, her eyes sharp and predatory as she paced around a central platform. She didn't offer a hug, she simply pointed to the stage. "Get up there," Janet commanded, her voice vibrating with the thrill of a creator about to strike. "Lose the coat. I need to see the architecture Jared tried to bury." 4 hours. The studio was a whirlwind of motion. Janet worked with a feverish intensity, pinned silk between her teeth and slashing through expensive muslin with silver shears. There were no catalogs, no trends, and no compromises. They weren't making a dress for a guest. They were constructing a suit of armor for a conqueror. Janet draped heavy, midnight black silk over Tamara's frame, the fabric so deep and lustrous it seemed to swallow the studio's light. It was a gown of liquid shadow, designed to skim Tamara's body with a discipline that spoke of old-world elegance and untouchable power. "The dress is the foundation," Janet murmured, her hands moving with the precision of a surgeon as she tucked a seam. "It tells them you are serious. But the gold tells them you are the sun they've been too blind to see." From a locked cedar chest, Janet retrieved a length of heavy, molten gold silk. It wasn't a mere accessory. It was a royalty scarf, woven with intricate patterns that caught the light like the embers of a dying fire. She draped it over Tamara's shoulders, letting it fall in a regal, asymmetrical sweep that framed Tamara's face. The contrast was startling. The black was the silence of the last 10 years, but the gold was the roar of the legacy that preceded it. As the final pins were replaced by invisible stitches, Janet stepped back, breathing hard. She turned Tamara toward a floor-to-ceiling triptych mirror. Tamara hesitated, her eyes downcast by habit, her shoulders still braced for the weight of a cleaning cart. "Look at yourself, Tamara," Janet whispered, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Stop looking for the janitor. She's gone." Tamara lifted her gaze, and for a heartbeat, her breath hitched. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, yet more familiar than the reflection she had lived with for a decade. The gown didn't just fit her body, it restored her height. Her neck looked long and graceful, her skin glowing against the dark silk. The gold scarf sat upon her shoulders like the mantle of a high priestess. The exhaustion that had etched lines into her face seemed to have transformed into a look of profound, unshakable wisdom. She reached up, her fingers, no longer hidden by yellow rubber, touching the fine silk. She saw the strength in her own arms, the clarity in her eyes, and the quiet authority in her stance. She looked like a woman who didn't just clean the halls of power, but one who had built them from the ground up. The cleaning lady was a skin she had finally molted, revealing the polished diamond beneath. "Jared thinks he's going to see a punchline," Janet said, standing behind her and placing a hand on her shoulder. "He's expecting a woman who is embarrassed to be there. He wants you to look like you're drowning in a world that's too big for you. Instead, you're going to look like you've come to collect the keys to the kingdom." Janet reached into her pocket and produced a small, velvet-lined case. Inside sat a pair of gold earrings, simple and bold. "These were your mother's. Your father gave them to me for safekeeping when the creditors started circling. He told me to give them back to you when you were ready to stand in the light again." Tamara took the earrings, her hands perfectly steady. As she clipped them on, the final piece of the transformation clicked into place. She wasn't just wearing clothes, she was wearing her history. She was wearing the respect her father had earned and the resilience she had forged in the dark. "I'm ready," Tamara said, and her voice didn't just fill the room, it commanded it. "I know you are," Janet replied, a fierce, proud smile lighting up her face. "Now, go to that estate. Don't say a word until the silence is so loud it starts to make them sweat. Let them wonder who you are. And when they finally realize, make sure they never forget." Tamara stepped off the platform, the black silk whispering against the floor. It was a sound of elegance, of hidden depths, and of an impending storm. The janitor was dead. The queen had returned. And as she walked toward the door, her reflection in the glass didn't show a woman hiding from the world, but a woman the world was finally going to have to answer to. The gravel drive of the Grand Magnolia estate crunched beneath the tires of the sleek black sedan like a million breaking diamonds. The air outside was cool, scented with blooming jasmine and the heavy, expensive perfume of the city's elite. As the valet opened the door, Tamara took a single, steadying breath. She felt the weight of the gold royalty scarf against her neck and the whisper of the midnight black silk against her legs. She wasn't just walking into a party, she was walking into a reclamation. As she stepped out, the noise of the gala, the clinking of crystal, the soft hum of a string quartet, the superficial laughter of 100 guests, seemed to falter for a heartbeat. The light from the massive iron lanterns caught the molten gold on her shoulders, making her look like she was wreathed in flame. Tamara didn't rush. She moved with a slow, rhythmic grace, her head held at an angle that demanded attention without saying a word. Inside the grand ballroom, Jared Evers was the center of a boisterous circle. He was holding a glass of vintage champagne, his eyes scanning the entrance with a hungry, cruel anticipation. He had already told his closest friends to keep their cameras ready. He had described Tamara's likely outfit: polyester, pilled, and perhaps a shade of brown that matched her mop bucket. He was prepared for a laugh that would solidify his status as the ultimate puppet master. The music was in the middle of a lively Vivaldi piece when the double doors swung open. A silence began at the back of the room and moved forward like a physical wave. One by one, the titans of industry and the queens of society turned their heads. They didn't see a cleaning lady. They saw a vision of such profound elegance that it made the rest of the room's finery look like costume jewelry. Tamara stood in the archway, the black gown lengthening her silhouette into something statuesque, the gold scarf gleaming with a regal brilliance that matched the heavy signet ring on her finger. Jared's laughter died in his throat. The glass in his hand tilted precariously as his brain struggled to reconcile the image of the woman who scrubbed his floors with a deity standing 20 feet away. The mocking comment he had prepared evaporated, replaced by a cold, sudden hollow in his chest. This wasn't the punchline. This was a catastrophe. Tamara began to walk. The crowd parted instinctively, a sea of silk and wool retreating to create a path for her. She didn't look at the waiters or the decorations. Her eyes were fixed on Jared, her gaze as sharp and unwavering as a predator's. As she passed, whispers began to ripple through the crowd, not whispers of mockery, but of confused admiration. "Who is she? Is that a Janet original? Look at that scarf. That's authentic gold weave." Jared stood frozen as Tamara finally reached his circle. His board members, the same ones who had giggled in the hallway just days ago, were now staring at her with wide, unrecognizing eyes. They were enchanted by the very woman they had dismissed as furniture. "Mr. Evers," Tamara said. Her voice was low and resonant, carrying through the sudden hush of the ballroom like a bell. "You invited me to see your world. I thought it only fair that I showed you mine." Jared swallowed hard, his face pale beneath the tan he'd bought in the Hamptons. "Tamara," he stammered, his voice cracking. How is this possible?" "You spent so much time looking at the floor, Jared, that you forgot to see who was standing on it," she replied. She reached out and took a glass of champagne from a passing tray with a hand that was perfectly steady. The gold of her ring flashed under the chandeliers. "You wanted a show tonight. You wanted everyone to talk about the cleaning lady." She looked around the room, making eye contact with the wealthiest men in the state, her expression one of calm, effortless superiority. "I believe you got exactly what you asked for. But you should have been careful, Jared. When you invite the ghost of a legacy you helped bury, you shouldn't be surprised when she brings the light back with her." The terror in Jared's eyes was now visible to everyone. He looked small. He looked like a boy playing dress-up in a room full of adults. The joke had been flipped, and the entire ballroom was now witnessing his humiliation. The woman he had intended to make a laughingstock was now the sun around which the entire event revolved, and Jared was nothing more than a shadow rapidly disappearing in her wake. Tamara took a slow sip of the champagne, her eyes never leaving his. The shock of the century wasn't just her arrival, it was the realization that the power in the room had shifted. The cleaning lady hadn't just arrived at the gala, she had taken it over. The tension in the ballroom was a physical weight, thick enough to stifle the air. Jared stood stammering, his face flushing a humiliated shade of purple as he searched for a way to reclaim the narrative. But before he could utter another word of his faltering defense, a heavy, authoritative cane thudded twice against the marble floor. The sound was like a gavel bringing a chaotic courtroom to order. From the shadow of a grand floral arrangement stepped Arthur Sterling. He was a man whose name was synonymous with the city's very foundation, a mogul of the old guard whose approval could make a career and whose silence could end one. His eyes, sharp and clear despite his age, were fixed not on the CEO, but on the woman in black and gold. The crowd instinctively parted for him. Arthur approached Tamara with a slow, deliberate reverence that caused a ripple of confusion to pass through the younger guests. He stopped just inches from her, his gaze traveling from her face to the heavy gold signet ring on her finger. A look of profound realization washed over his features, and for a moment, the iron-willed titan of industry looked almost moved to tears. "I have lived a very long time," Arthur began, his voice a deep rasp that carried to every corner of the room. "And in all those years, I have only known one family with the courage to wear that crest and the grace to carry that name. You are Marcus Johnson's daughter." It wasn't a question, it was a proclamation. The name Johnson echoed through the ballroom, hitting the guests like a physical blow. The younger executives looked puzzled, but the older men and women, the ones who truly held the keys to the city, gasped. They remembered the Johnson Empire. They remembered the man who had mentored them all before a series of ruthless takeovers had erased his name from the letterheads, but never from their memories. Tamara nodded once, her voice clear and unafraid. "I am Tamara Johnson, Mr. Sterling. It is an honor to see you again." Arthur turned his head toward Jared, and the warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a cold, blistering contempt. "Jared, I have sat on your board for 3 years. I have watched you build your little glass kingdom on the bones of men better than you. But I never imagined you were capable of something this small, this pathetic." Jared stepped back, his hands shaking. "Arthur, you don't understand. She's a janitor. She cleans the building. I thought it would be a bit of fun." "A bit of fun?" Arthur's voice rose, vibrating with a fury that silenced the last of the whispers. "You found a woman of royal business lineage, the daughter of the man who gave me my first break, and because she fell on hard times, you decided to use her as a prop? You invited her here to be a punchline." The silence that followed was deafening. The board members who had laughed earlier now stared at their shoes, suddenly terrified of being associated with Jared's joke. The elite guests who had come to celebrate Jared were now looking at him with the same disgust they might show a bug on a silk rug. "You speak of class, Jared," Arthur continued, stepping closer until he was looming over the younger man. "But you have none. Class is not the car you drive or the suit you wear. Class is how you treat those who have nothing to give you. And tonight, you have shown this entire city that despite your millions, You are a very poor man indeed." Arthur turned back to Tamara and, in a gesture that would be discussed in the city's social circles for decades, he bowed his head. "Your father was my mentor, Tamara. He was the finest man I ever knew. To see his daughter treated with such disrespect in a house built on the principles he pioneered is a disgrace I will not be a part of." He looked around at the room, his gaze a challenge to anyone who dared to disagree. "I am leaving this gala, and I suggest that anyone here who values integrity over a free drink should do the same." The exodus began almost immediately. It started with the older moguls and their wives, who followed Arthur toward the exit with icy glares directed at Jared. Then the younger investors, sensing the shift in power, began to trickle out, leaving the ballroom feeling suddenly cavernous and cold. Jared stood in the center of the shrinking crowd, his empire crumbling in real time. The social ambush he had planned for Tamara had become his own professional execution. His reputation was not just tarnished, it was ruined. No one would want to do business with a man who had been publicly rebuked by Arthur Sterling for being a petty bully. Tamara stood her ground, watching the man who had tried to break her. She didn't feel the need to gloat. The sight of him standing alone amidst the half-empty tables and the cooling champagne was enough. She had come here as a ghost, and she was leaving as a legend. "You wanted everyone to talk about me, Jared," Tamara said softly, her voice the final nail in the coffin of his pride. "And they will. 4 years. But they won't be talking about my uniform. They'll be talking about yours." She turned away then, the black silk of her gown whispering against the floor. She walked past the remaining guests, her head held high, the gold scarf catching the light of the chandeliers one last time. As she reached the door, she didn't look back. Behind her, the Grand Magnolia was silent, the joke was over, and for Jared Evers, the long, cold night of his irrelevance had just begun. The cool night air met Tamara as she stepped out of the heavy oak doors of the Grand Magnolia, and for the first time in 10 years, it didn't feel like a chill she had to endure, but a wind that was carrying her forward. Behind her, the sounds of the gala had changed. The music had stopped, replaced by the hushed, frantic murmurs of a crowd that had just witnessed the fall of a pretender and the resurrection of a queen. The light from the estate's lanterns cast long, elegant shadows across the gravel drive, and as Tamara walked toward the gates, she felt the phantom weight of the cleaning cart she had pushed for a decade finally vanish from her shoulders. At the end of the drive, the black sedan was waiting. Janet was leaning against the door, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. She hadn't gone inside. She didn't need to. She had seen the exodus of the city's elite, led by Arthur Sterling, and she knew exactly what that meant. As Tamara approached, Janet straightened up, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "You look different," Janet said softly, her eyes scanning Tamara's face. "The dress is the same, the gold is the same, but the woman is different." "I stopped waiting for someone to give me permission to exist, Janet," Tamara replied, her voice steady and resonant in the quiet night. "I spent 10 years trying to be invisible because I thought it was the only way to survive. I didn't realize that being invisible just gives people like Jared the permission to be cruel." Janet opened the car door, but Tamara paused, looking back at the glowing windows of the mansion. In the distance, she could see the silhouette of Jared Evers standing on the balcony, alone, looking down at the empty driveway. He looked small, a tiny, flickering spark of a man who had confused wealth with worth. "What now?" Janet asked as they pulled away from the estate, the lights of the Grand Magnolia fading into the rear-view mirror. "The city is going to be screaming your name by morning. Arthur Sterling won't let this rest. He'll be at your door before the sun is up, probably with a board seat and a checkbook." Tamara watched the city skyline approach, the tall towers of glass and steel reaching for the stars. 4 years, those buildings had represented her cage, the places where she scrubbed the floors and emptied the bins. Now, they looked like a blueprint. "Arthur is a good man, but I don't want a seat at Jared's table," Tamara said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm going to build my own. My father didn't just build skyscrapers. He built communities. He built foundations that supported people, not just bank accounts. That's the legacy I'm reclaiming. The Johnson Foundation isn't just a memory anymore. It's a promise." She looked down at her hands. The calluses were still there, a map of the decade she had spent in the shadows. She realized now that those years hadn't been a waste. They had taught her the secrets of the city that the men in the penthouses would never know. She knew the struggles of the people who kept the world running. She knew what it felt like to be ignored, and she knew exactly how much power lay in the hands of the invisible. "I'm going to start with the tower," Tamara continued, a spark of visionary fire lighting up her eyes. "Jared's reputation is in ruins. His investors will flee by Monday. I'm going to buy back my father's stake. I'm going to turn that building into a place where the people who clean the floors are treated with the same respect as the people who sign the contracts." He looked around at the room, his gaze a challenge to anyone who dared to disagree. "I am leaving this gala, and I suggest that anyone here who values integrity over a free drink should do the same." The exodus began almost immediately. It started with the older moguls and their wives, who followed Arthur toward the exit with icy glares directed at Jared. Then the younger investors, sensing the shift in power, began to trickle out, leaving the ballroom feeling suddenly cavernous and cold. Jared stood in the center of the shrinking crowd, his empire crumbling in real time. The social ambush he had planned for Tamara had become his own professional execution. His reputation was not just tarnished, it was ruined. No one would want to do business with a man who had been publicly rebuked by Arthur Sterling for being a petty bully. Tamara stood her ground, watching the man who had tried to break her. She didn't feel the need to gloat. The sight of him standing alone amidst the half-empty tables and the cooling champagne was enough. She had come here as a ghost, and she was leaving as a legend. "You wanted everyone to talk about me, Jared," Tamara said softly, her voice the final nail in the coffin of his pride. "And they will. 4 years. But they won't be talking about my uniform. They'll be talking about yours." She turned away then, the black silk of her gown whispering against the floor. She walked past the remaining guests, her head held high, the gold scarf catching the light of the chandeliers one last time. As she reached the door, she didn't look back. Behind her, The Grand Magnolia was silent. The joke was over, and for Jared Evers, the long, cold night of his irrelevance had just begun. The cool night air met Tamara as she stepped out of the heavy oak doors of the Grand Magnolia, and for the first time in 10 years, it didn't feel like a chill she had to endure, but a wind that was carrying her forward. Behind her, the sounds of the gala had changed. The music had stopped, replaced by the hushed, frantic murmurs of a crowd that had just witnessed the fall of a pretender and the resurrection of a queen. The light from the estate's lanterns cast long, elegant shadows across the gravel drive, and as Tamara walked toward the gates, she felt the phantom weight of the cleaning cart she had pushed for a decade finally vanish from her shoulders. At the end of the drive, the black sedan was waiting. Janet was leaning against the door, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. She hadn't gone inside. She didn't need to. She had seen the exodus of the city's elite, led by Arthur Sterling, and she knew exactly what that meant. As Tamara approached, Janet straightened up, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "You look different," Janet said softly, her eyes scanning Tamara's face. "The dress is the same, the gold is the same, but the woman is different." "I stopped waiting for someone to give me permission to exist, Janet," Tamara replied, her voice steady and resonant in the quiet night. "I spent 10 years trying to be invisible because I thought it was the only way to survive. I didn't realize that being invisible just gives people like Jared the permission to be cruel." Janet opened the car door, but Tamara paused, looking back at the glowing windows of the mansion. In the distance, she could see the silhouette of Jared Evers standing on the balcony, alone, looking down at the empty driveway. He looked small, a tiny, flickering spark of a man who had confused wealth with worth. "What now?" Janet asked as they pulled away from the estate, the lights of the Grand Magnolia fading into the rear-view mirror. "The city is going to be screaming your name by morning. Arthur Sterling won't let this rest. He'll be at your door before the sun is up, probably with a board seat and a checkbook." Tamara watched the city skyline approach, the tall towers of glass and steel reaching for the stars. 4 years, those buildings had represented her cage, the places where she scrubbed the floors and emptied the bins. Now, they looked like a blueprint. "Arthur is a good man, but I don't want a seat at Jared's table," Tamara said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm going to build my own. My father didn't just build skyscrapers. He built communities. He built foundations that supported people, not just bank accounts. That's the legacy I'm reclaiming. The Johnson Foundation isn't just a memory anymore. It's a promise." She looked down at her hands. The calluses were still there, a map of the decade she had spent in the shadows. She realized now that those years hadn't been a waste. They had taught her the secrets of the city that the men in the penthouses would never know. She knew the struggles of the people who kept the world running. She knew what it felt like to be ignored, and she knew exactly how much power lay in the hands of the invisible. "I'm going to start with the tower," Tamara continued, a spark of visionary fire lighting up her eyes. "Jared's reputation is in ruins. His investors will flee by Monday. I'm going to buy back my father's stake. I'm going to turn that building into a place where the people who clean the floors are treated with the same respect as the people who sign the contracts.